Hello and welcome to the Crescendo Guide to Shannox on 10-man mode in the Firelands. This guide is going to focus on strategy and also on troubleshooting, going over some common problems that you might run into when defeating this encounter. Now, first things first, if you're new to the Firelands, you may be wondering how exactly do you spawn Shannox, as if you look on the map, he does not actually spawn in the area that he appears. The trick is that you need to kill a certain amount of trash before he spawns. No one has worked out the exact numbers yet to my knowledge, but it's somewhere in the neighborhood of about 20 pulls worth. It should take you somewhere between 45 minutes and an hour, depending on how quick your DPS is and how swiftly your tank is moving along and pulling new trash packs. You'll note as you kill trash packs in the Firelands that you'll see some emotes. After you've killed some, you'll hear something about a hunter's horn sounding, and then later on it'll sound more urgently. And then, those are basically like thirds of the amount of trash to kill. On the first third, you'll get that first emote. Second third, you get the second emote. And then after you've killed the last third of trash that you need to kill, for him to spawn, he will appear, and you'll get another emote for it. Once he has spawned, he'll appear at the spot that he's marked on the map, and he'll patrol in a big circle, following the road from his spawn position towards the entrance of the Firelands, and then back around. It's worth noting that it takes him roughly 2 minutes to complete a full circuit. So you do need to pull him as he's patrolling, so the group isn't ready to pull him, then you have to wait for him to come all the way back around, which can take a while, so just be prepared for that. As far as choosing where to fight Shannox, it's ultimately up to you. You can fight him pretty much anywhere along his patrol path. We choose to fight Shannox next to the fork in the road because it gives us an easy point of reference and also leaves lots of the road open, which it's actually easier to see Shannox's traps on the road as opposed to on the ground where there's lots of fiery particles and whatnot. You should take a fairly standard raid composition for Shannox, so that'll be 2 tanks, 3 healers, and 5 DPS. As far as execution goes, Shannox is primarily a tank fight. The success or failure of the fight relies almost entirely on the skills of your Riplim tank. As you'll see, Shannox comes with 2 faithful hounds on his side, Riplim and Rageface. Riplim will need a tank of his own, as will Shannox, whereas Rageface is untankable and will randomly choose raid members to attack. When you make the pull, you're going to want to pull Shannox and Riplim about 50 to 60 yards apart, but you have to be careful not to exceed 60 yards apart, as if you do, they will gain a buff called Separation Anxiety, which will quickly lead to them killing your tanks. So let's talk about Rageface first, since he's the easiest part of the fight. As mentioned, Rageface will randomly pick raid members to attack. When someone's being attacked by Rageface, there's really nothing that they can do about it, just needs to be healed through, although defensive cooldowns of course will help. Rageface will also use an ability called Face Rage periodically. When he's face raging, he will stun a target and deal increasing damage every 0.5 seconds to that target. It can usually kill somebody in a span of 7 or 8 seconds. So that person will need heals to keep them up, and DPS needs to be focused on Rageface during this time, because he won't stop face raging until he's taken a crit for at least 30,000 damage. The easiest way to deal with face rage is simply to have all your DPS focus on Rageface first. Once he's been killed, Shannox will gain a Frenzy buff, increasing his attack, speed, and damage by 30%, but on 10 man this is mostly healable, and it's easier to just deal with Rageface by taking him out of the fight completely. Now, throughout the whole fight, you're going to also have to worry about Shannox's traps, which he lays on the ground periodically under a random raid member, so DPS, tanks, and healers all need to be aware of this. He has 2 types of traps. One is the Immolation trap, which, if triggered, deals a significant amount of upfront damage as well as a damage over time effect, and also increases any damage dealt to the player during the time when the damage over time effect is still applied. Secondly, he has Crystal Prison traps. If you step into one of these, then you'll be locked into a crystal prison, which has about 2 million health, and you need to be broken out of the prison by the DPS, which wastes a significant amount of DPS time, and has other negative implications in the fight, which we'll get to in a minute. Now, moving on to the core mechanic of the fight, it really revolves around a debuff called Jagged Tear, which both Shannox and Riplim can apply to the tanks. This debuff will stack indefinitely and deals 3,000 physical damage per stack every 3 seconds. The debuff itself lasts for about 30 seconds, and it's applied every 10 seconds by both Riplim and by Shannox. So in order to get these stacks to drop before they become unhealable, you need to do a little bit of fancy footwork. The heavy lifting here mostly falls onto your Riplim tank. So what'll happen is the dogs, Riplim and Rageface both, are able to be trapped by Shannox's traps. So the easiest way to drop stacks from both tanks is to lure Riplim into one of the crystal prison traps. Now the timing of this is important since it's still a 30-second debuff, and the crystal prison traps only last about 10 seconds when they're applied to the dogs. So what will happen is periodically Shannox will throw out his spear. While his spear is away from him, he cannot do Arcing Slash, which is the attack that applies Jagged Tear. So when he throws the spear, it'll hit the entire raid for some moderate fire damage and leave behind a little fire spiral that needs to be avoided by everyone in the raid because that does additional damage. Shortly after that, Riplim's going to break off of the Riplim tank, pick up the spear, and carry it back to Shannox. Now, if the tank is able to drag Riplim into a crystal prison trap either right before Shannox throws his spear or in the brief period of time in between when he actually throws the spear and when it impacts, then that should lock out the Jagged Tear from both the boss and Riplim for long enough for the stacks to drop off. You'll be able to tell when the spear is in the air because a little red circle will appear on the floor, which will indicate the impact point. Now, if there's no crystal prison traps available or there's none that are conveniently placed, another option is for the Riplim tank to actually drag Riplim toward the boss. So in other words, what you need to do is wait for the spear to be thrown so you see the little red effect appear on the floor, and then immediately start dragging the Riplim toward the boss. That way, when the spear impacts, Riplim's going to have to run away from the boss to get the spear and then run all the way back to the boss to give him his spear back, during which time the stacks should be able to be dropped off of both Riplim's tank and Shannox's tank. It's also worth noting that during this time Riplim can be slowed to a certain degree. He gains a buff which will reduce the amount of slow that he takes over time, but he can be slowed at least immediately as soon as he breaks off of the Riplim tank. So it's obviously helpful to have as many slows as possible to keep him from reaching the boss quickly. There will almost be certainly times when stacks do not end up dropping off the tanks after a spear throw. If this happens, there's no need to panic. Usually, as long as your healers are on top of things, it's fairly simple to keep your tanks healed up through even up to 9 stacks of the Jagged Tear debuff. It's only once it gets past that point for an extended period of time that it's going to likely start draining the healer's mana and becoming a serious threat to the tank's longevity. As noted earlier, you're going to want to kill Rageface first, which is going to cause Shannox to go into a frenzy and increase his damage output, but it still should be fairly healable. From that point, you need to choose your targets more carefully. When Shannox is brought below 30% health, if either of the dogs are still alive, they'll enter an enraged state, which will literally wipe you out within seconds. So it's very important not to bring Shannox below 30% before both dogs are dead. However, you do want Shannox to be low on health before you kill Riplim, because once you've killed Riplim, Shannox will enter his second phase, during which, instead of throwing his spear, he will simply jam it into the floor, dealing a similar damage effect and flame spiral effect as it did in the first phase. However, it'll also leave a debuff on the entire raid, which increases fire damage taken by 40%. This debuff does stack, so with each attack, the raid will be taking progressively more damage until the point where everyone is essentially one-shot by the attack. So if Shannox is too high in health when this happens, you will inevitably wipe to that effect. So you want to push Shannox down to about 35% after you've killed Rageface, of course, and then kill Riplim, and then finish off Shannox while its health is low, saving Bloodlust and Heroism and Time Warp for this phase. Assuming that your DPS is up to par and you haven't wasted too much time having to break raid members out of the crystal prison traps, you should have plenty of time to kill Shannox. This kill that we did here took about 8 minutes and 32 seconds. If your DPS is stronger, it'll obviously take you less time. You have up to 10 minutes to kill him before he will enrage and wipe you automatically. That concludes the strategy portion of the video. If you want to learn more specifics about how to deal with certain mechanics, or if you're struggling in dealing with certain fight mechanics, then you should click the link and check out the troubleshooting video, which is the exact same video, just with different narration, covering very specific elements of the fight that may be causing you grief. Thanks for watching.